Hello and welcome to your go-to Detroit Pistons podcast, the Pistons Pulse, co-hosted by me, Bryce Simon of Motor City Hoops, a former D1 hooper and current teacher, husband, and father of 3 amazing kids.
And I'm Omari Sankofa, the second Pistons beat writer for the Detroit Free Press.
And of course, we're always blessed to be joined by our producer, Wes Davenport, who you should be listening to on the Detroit Bad Boys YouTube channel with the pin down, and almost left me hanging on the intro as his screen went black and was not counting me down. I did not realize how I am reliant on that on the intro. But today we are joined by a very, very special guest, Nate Duncan of the Dunked On podcast of the Hollinger and Duncan and NBA strategy stream on League Pass. Really excited to have you, Nate, out in Hawaii. This is why we have a very unique time for this podcast. So, Nate, how are you doing? Thank you for joining the Pistons Pulse.
Yeah, I'm doing good. I like that intro, by the way. It's very realistic, like sneakers squeaking and buzzer and stuff. I got the good headphones on today, so I was able to really get in the mood for this show.
Yeah, that was the OG Omari. That goes even Robin Chan is our guy now, but that went to our original audio guy. And I think that was the first thing he sent us. Like that was the first one he gave us whenever we put the podcast together, Omari. And I was like, no, this is the vibes. This is nice.
Yeah. I'm like, if it's 7:30 in the morning and I'm on my commute to work with coffee and like I hear that puts me immediately in the basketball mood. Like that's just like early open gym energy.
Yes. All right, Nate, let's get right into it. We want to take advantage of your time here. I want to go back to the offseason because, right, we all know the Pistons are 8-11 right now and some things have gone well and it's better than the 14 wins we saw last year. But they made some moves and some changes this offseason. So first and foremost, what did you think about the firing of Monty Williams and more importantly, the hiring of JB Bickerstaff? Did you think that would be a good fit? Did it make sense to you at the time this past offseason?
Well, I mean, we probably got to go back even further to the fact that they hired Trajan Langdon, right?
Yeah.
That's
sure.
a maybe even a bigger deal because what I had quibbled with many a time was the Pistons' direction. And I felt Troy Weaver, although he had a pretty decent record of identifying talent, and I think even did a pretty decent job of drafting in the Pistons slots when he did have the opportunity, that I didn't think like he had a great understanding of just how to put a team together that would work. I mean, just with like all the centers that he acquired. So that was one, just not someone who really seemed to value modern spacing, not only for winning, but simply as a development environment for the likes of Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey. And then the other thing that I would say too, is he didn't really seem to have a great grasp of just what the value of players were with some of his signings and some of the trades that he made, like the Marvin Bagley trade, for example, the Wiseman trade, just kind of picked up some of these distressed assets, but actually gave up real stuff to get them. So those are some of the issues that I had with Troy Weaver. It wasn't really working. And then also, just sort of it seemed like he was both coming and going at the same time, right? Like they would, in theory, be trying to get better, but also, they would end up tanking every year as well. And you compare the Pistons rebuild to some of the other ones that have been successful, they've never actually been plus picks, right? Like like an OKC, a Utah, like when teams when you're going to be that bad, you should be holding open salary cap space. You should trade away veterans. They were in a difficult position because they didn't have many veterans to trade away at the start of the rebuild. But for them to actually be like minus a lottery protected-ish pick was not great. So moving on from Troy Weaver, I think was necessary. Trajan Langdon, I think, has had a little bit of a mixed record so far with some of his stuff, but then they were able to bring in JB Bickerstaff, who I think, given his track record, is the perfect developmental coach for this team. I said it actually on my show that if I had to pick a coach for this team only, like JB Bickerstaff might be a top 10 coach. I'm not sure he's a top 10 coach for, say, the Cleveland Cavaliers trying to make that next step into championship contention. But as far as building habits for a young team, I think he's proved so far to be everything that Monty Williams wasn't able to be for these guys.
So Nate, Trajan comes in and essentially inherits the same core that Troy put together, but he adds to it. Sometimes GMs come in and they kind of come in with a sledgehammer. Trajan kind of kept it going. You add Tobias, you add THJ and Malik Beasley, and I know early on in the season you were following the Pistons pretty closely. I saw you in Washington last week, which was a win. I guess when you look at this core and you look at the guys that Trajan added, just what's your view of the team as far as, I guess, just a completeness standpoint, right? Like obviously they still have a ways to go, but they did address some of the shooting struggles that they had last season.
Yeah, I think that certainly they did accomplish that. Like, this is actually a real NBA team right now with real NBA shooting, and their four-man isn't a center. They play only one center at a time, and both those guys, Stewart and Duren, I think have been much better as a result of that. And Hardaway Jr., again, I didn't really care for the price that was paid to acquire him, but he did fill a niche. I they could have just signed Malik Beasley and not brought in Hardaway Jr. Like, I would have been fine with that. But they're putting lineups out there around Cade sometimes. I have Hardaway Jr. and Malik Beasley, and then a power forward who can actually make a shot. So those, they operate like I would say on both ends actually like a real NBA team at this point, although I didn't really kind of care for the value proposition of some of the moves in the offseason. And so we could talk about that. But in terms of just like taking at least a slight step forward to be a team that's going to be a little easier on the eyes and be competitive and give these guys, Duren, Ivy, Cade, their main prospects, a chance to develop. And we'll see whether Thompson and Holland can take steps forward as well. But for those three guys, this has just been a much better environment so far.
Let's talk about those vet signings, or I guess in one case, a trade. I would like to get your thoughts on all three, quite honestly. So take your time and work through them if you want. Take as much time as you want. You mentioned the value of THJ. We were just talking before the start about how Quentin Grimes is showing some life in Dallas of being that two-way wing, which a young team like the Pistons could use. They signed Beasley to the 1-year deal and then Tobias to the 2 years and $52 million. We can talk about what they've actually done this year, and we do that all the time, but I want to get your thoughts on what you thought in the moment in terms of, were they good signings, and then also the value, because I think that's when you start to evaluate Trajan Langdon as a decision maker. It's just not bringing in the right guys, it's at the right price and sending out the right things to acquire them, etc. So what were your thoughts in the moment?
Well, I love the Beasley signing. Price was right, 1 year, $6 million. My one criticism, and he's again a guy who's not necessarily a tentpole guy, and will struggle with his defensive recognition and losing his man. He's not been the defender that he was drafted to be originally, but he's a really high quality shooter who can bomb it, that you can run plays for. Like, just having the ability to have different type of actions you can run other than a Cade pick and roll every single time is really useful, right? So bringing him in, love the concept of it. My one criticism, and this goes to the other two signings, is like, why not just sign him for longer? Throw him a little bit more. Like, would he have signed for 3 years, $24 million? Like, could you have gotten him for that, or even 3 years, 30? Like that's I thought that the market was artificially depressed this offseason, and Beasley, he signed for the minimum last year in Milwaukee, but you had all these teams that are taxed out. Everyone's scared of the second apron. The Pistons are a team that has a lot of spending flexibility. So why not try to get a guy who, at a price that where he could just be a bench player in the future for these guys, but that where he could actually be a part of what you're trying to build long term, or maybe even a trade piece too. Whereas 1 year, $6 million, I realized he would want to rebuild his value. You would probably need to pay him a little bit more than that to get him on a longer term deal, but they had the flexibility to do that. I think that, $10 million a year, $8 million a year for Beasley would have been a fine contract. And that brings us to spending the space on Hardaway. Yes, they did get, I think it was 3 second rounders. I don't recall the exact nature of those, but you give up Quentin Grimes, who I actually think is probably a better player than Tim Hardaway Jr. I know they're worried about his health in that deal, so didn't love that. I think Hardaway Jr. has been decent for them this year. Again, adding another shooter, which they probably needed.
Hey, Nate, he leads the NBA in charges drawn too. Who knew? Who would have thought that Tim Hardaway Jr.
That is
the effort's been there.
Yeah, I mean, and so I do appreciate that aspect of it. They have defended reasonably well. But then the Harris thing was really, I just didn't really understand how anyone could have watched his season in Philly a year ago. And he is a professional player. He's a guy that you're at least going to have to guard a little bit on the perimeter, but he just wasn't really able to create his own shot particularly well in Philly anymore at his age. This is his age 32 season. So 2 years at 25 million a year. I just like, who else was offering him more than 15? Why did you need to go to that level? And hey, if someone was offering him more than 15 over 2 years, then you can just sign somebody else. That's I really think that yes, they did have a little bit of money burning a hole in their pocket, but or fine, even 1 year 25 million with the second year non-guarantee. Why not go there? So I really just didn't understand, particularly that second year. Like, you can say, okay, 1 year, we don't have anything else to use our money on, fine, we'll use it, we'll roll it over to next year. But there just, to me, was nobody else trying to pay Tobias Harris above the mid-level. You saw players that I considered superior to him, particularly for winning teams, getting less than the mid-level.
So Nate, you mentioned that you had a pretty high opinion of JB, and just for this Pistons team, he was probably one of the top coaches you could see being a good fit. What was it about JB? And I mean, he had Memphis, of course, he had Cleveland, so he had experience building up young rosters. Was it just that with JB that you liked for this Pistons team, that he has a track record for getting you at least to ground level? And what else about JB stood out to you that made that signing a good one for you?
Yeah, getting them to ground level. I think that's a good analogy. His previous steps in Houston and in Memphis, he had come in as an interim coach, and I thought in Houston it was really tough. They fired Kevin McHale. Like, he was never going to be the permanent coach there. That was his first go round, and then Memphis, I thought he got them to play hard, but again, a new regime swept in, and they went with Taylor Jenkins, and both those seemed like good hires at the time. And then he takes over. I guess all three of his things were interim to begin with, right? Because he took over for John Beeline in Cleveland, and like, I just was incredibly impressed with how he developed that team defensively and their culture and their habits. Like, you look at Darius Garland, suddenly, not a great physical defender, but like, you could put him on the other team's point guard. He would try to pressure the ball. Donovan Mitchell was a total liability in Utah, and JB Bickerstaff got him to actually try. He developed Evan Mobley as a big man into a real force. He developed Jared Allen into a real force as well. And you look at the lineups that he put out there with the Cavaliers. I mean, I think they have solid defensive talent, but these are like a top 5 defense every year, built around a couple of really good defenders, but then also like Karis LeVert's another guy who just was a complete sieve in Brooklyn, and all of a sudden he develops into being almost a stopper level of player. So that's the biggest thing, is that he just got guys to compete. He got them to execute. He got them to pressure the ball and bring it every single night. And that is what this Pistons team, as you guys know, having watched it over the last few years, so desperately needed.
Yeah, and we've seen it change, right? In 19 games, all of a sudden, this team is 12th in defensive rating. We've seen a couple games that weren't great, but let's go ahead and use that to start talking about this season and the face of the franchise, Cade Cunningham. I know we've talked a lot about Cade Cunningham offensively. We've questioned his defense a little bit over the past few years, and I thought it's been much improved this year.
Yeah,
kind of
that's another guy, right? He came
yes.
in his rookie year, and like, you're like, oh, this guy actually can defend. Like, he's blocking a few shots, and then in part because he had to create every single look for this team, and in part because it was a lost cause. He did slip there. So yeah, I agree with you. I've been impressed by his renaissance.
Where are you at with Cade Cunningham? I mean, we're not gonna sit here and ask you to like redraft that draft or rank Cade in terms of young players in the NBA or whatever. What have you thought about kind of his career overall? You mentioned kind of his rookie season, then he had the injury season. This team hasn't won a lot. Now he comes back this year. He's averaging essentially 24, 9, and 7. Shooting percentages are still a little bit not where you would want. The defense is much improved. The turnovers are back up this year. A lot to unpack with Cade. Where are you at when you watch him play, when you look at the numbers? What are your thoughts on him? I know we evaluate him, Nate, as the face of the franchise type player. So I guess asking you to evaluate him as that type of player.
Yeah, I think it's been incremental progress for him on the offensive end, which the defensive stuff is nice, certainly, but that's not his raison d'etre on this team. And so I think, he's, to me, as I watch him, he's looked a little bit quicker. He's been able to get separation a little bit more.
Yep.
But ultimately, he doesn't generate great shots for himself. And you could use the spacing as an excuse in prior years. They're still not an amazing shooting team, but he's actually operating with NBA spacing. So he's got to be able to do one of two things. He's got to be able to generate better looks, or he's got to make the hard looks that he's generating. And he's, again, made incremental improvement there, but nothing that makes you think like, oh, that he's on the way to being an absolute superstar. So I think the best way to look at this is for my subscription site, Dunked On Prime, we have a metric that basically measures shot quality, what you would expect a guy to shoot based on where he's shooting from and whether it's contested or not. And so that metric is very much at the bottom of the league, which you'll see for some guys, right? Like, Damian Lillard is in this range, James Harden. So it's basically right about 49% expected field goal percentage. And, like a Kevin Durant will be in that range usually. Brandon Ingram is annually the lowest. He's at about 47%. And Cade is right at that range, but he doesn't actually make those shots at a higher rate than expected, which is the problem, right? Like KD, DeMar DeRozan, and like these guys who kind of get pretty similar looks to him just are amazing at making those shots. And he's not. He's making those shots at about what you would expect, but they're not really great shots. And so that's really kind of the problem for his individual scoring. Like his passing is pretty good, obviously. I still think that, him is like the point guard, bring it up every time is not the perfect role for him. But that's the problem to me, is just he still isn't creating great shots, or he's got to just be a great bad shot maker. Neither has really occurred yet.
What do you think could help that the most then, Nate? You mentioned, I do think he creates separation better this year. We've seen a little bit more strength added to his frame, and that's helped a little bit. But I think, the numbers shoot, like he doesn't always finish well at the rim. If you go to NBA.com and look at rim finishing, he's in the lower part of that. The three,
not a lot of fouls.
Not a lot. So yeah, like, is it the rim finishing? Is it the fouls, or is it the 3-point percentage, Nate? Because this is always the debate. Where do you think? What's the number one thing you think to help that efficiency?
Yeah, I mean, the finishing is tough. We also keep a metric called contested finishing, where we look at what you shoot when you're contested inside of 10 feet on floaters and layups. He's at 47% there. That's pretty low. The league average is 53%. So that's, again, he's taking tough shots, but needs to be better as a finisher. So if it is going to improve for him, I think there's a couple of ways. I mean, number one would just be using his body a little bit more, Luka Doncic style, to just get guys off it. But he doesn't quite have that level of frame. Luka's 6'8", Cade's 6'6". Luka's probably 240, Cade's, 220, 225. And also Luka Doncic has one of the best handles ever at that size. Cade's is pretty good, but he's not quite at that level. So that might be one way. Another way is just maybe trying to use him a little bit differently, where it's not as much playing from the top of the floor out of pick and roll, where he's capable. But I've always thought that maybe trying to use him more along the lines of like how Boston uses Jason Tatum would be something that I'd like to see, where you could play him with more of a traditional point guard, play him at the 3 instead of the 1, and then, let him operate maybe a little bit more as a scorer than just the every single down playmaker. Now, they haven't really had that player. They tried to get it with Monte Morris last year. He was injured, so that didn't really work out. But, let him try to have him run pick and roll at smaller players, get into the post more where he's got that hook shot, maybe play out of that. I'm not sure any of these things are a panacea, but I do think that even now, too much is on his plate. Another metric that we have is what percentage of your shots are self-created. Basically, we say 2 seconds of touch time or more we consider self-created. 80% of his shots are self-created. That's a top 10 number in the league. Number 1 is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander at 91.5%. But even someone like Anthony Edwards or Kyrie Irving or Tyrese Halliburton, like these guys are all way below where Cade is. And so he's just not quite that level of like heliocentric creator to just be the be all end all of this offense. And so letting him play off the ball a little bit more, get a few catch and shoot looks, a few quick post ups, duck ins when he switched on smaller players, that maybe could help boost his efficiency. But they also, they don't really have anyone that could put him in that position necessarily.
All right, real quick shout out to my guy Edgar Gonzalez. This is one of my former students and players, so I appreciate him tuning in. You probably should be at work, Edgar. I don't know why you're watching on Facebook. And also the first panacea that has been dropped on the Pistons Pulse podcast. So Nate, thank you for increasing our vocabulary over here on the podcast. We're gonna go to a short break. When we come back, Omari, you can lead us off. We can stay with Cade, or we can move on. Your choice.
All right, we're back with segment 2. We're going to stay on Cade. There is, I feel like, an eternal debate in Pistons Twitter or just the Pistons fandom. Is Cade a point guard, right? Because he does have, you laid out a lot of the issues he's had, where essentially he's being overburdened. The turnovers are still a bit high. If you're putting a backcourt partner next to Cade just to make his life easier, what type of player are you thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily a high usage point guard, but Fred VanVleet would probably be the optimal, right? Someone who can shoot when they're off the ball, bring the ball up. That's another thing too, where why subject Cade to having to bring the ball up against pressure or something like that and sap his energy in that way. And then also someone who can defend, maybe switch a little bit on the defensive end, and that's a hard player to find, certainly, right? I mean, that's Monte Morris, I think, for a development would have been fine, right? But he also doesn't quite give you the shooting or defense that you ideally would want in that position. But yeah, someone along the lines of like a Jalen Suggs, Fred VanVleet sort of player. Someone also, obviously, because I think Jaden Ivey has emerged enough this year to show that he deserves some. It should be in the Pistons' long-term plans. I've really liked what I've seen from him so far this season, although there are still some things to work on there. So yeah, someone who could play next to Jaden Ivey, make Jaden Ivey the shooting guard, or maybe you make Jaden Ivey a little more point guard and just play Cade off the ball too, and have a more traditional shooting guard as well, because you do need to have shooting out there like a Beasley that you could run some plays for. So it's there's no necessarily perfect solution if you're also going to have Ivey out there, but that's the sort of player who can. Not necessarily a guy who's going to be a high usage guy, but who can bring the ball up, get you into the offense, and then also defend and shoot.
And I'm going to follow up real quick, but when you look at Jaden Ivey and, you saw him in person against Washington, what's popped about him to you? And I guess to what extent do you feel like he's helped address some of these concerns with Cade, or has he not yet?
Yeah, so I think for Ivy, a few things that have stood out, mostly two of them in particular. One is that he just seems stronger and more athletic and dynamic. I asked him about that after the game of what he worked on, and he said he really just tried to get stronger, and you could see it in that Washington game. Again, not a great defense, but his ability to get to the basket, get to the spots that he wanted to. The other nice thing about being stronger is you also have the option of slowing down a little bit. You're not totally reliant on your quickness. You just have another option to go to where you can do that bump Euro step type of finish. And so I think his finishing has been a little better. But probably the biggest thing would be that he's just more comfortable as a shooter this year. And I don't know that he's ever going to be great in that circumstance, but at least now, and this is something he talked about as well, when the defense goes under, he feels comfortable taking that shot, right? You can't just completely back off of him anymore. So those are the things that I like. I also, just in general, he hasn't been that effective creating his own shot, but he's been very effective actually spotting up when others create for him relative to where he's been in the past. So his evolving to be a better fit next to other players who are going to have the ball, like, of course, Cade Cunningham. And then they also, I think he's been reasonably successful as the primary backup point guard. They haven't had to go to Marcus Sasser or feel like they needed to bring in a Monte Morris. So the fact that he's at least been able to give them something when Cade's been off the floor, I think has been important as well.
Well, and I know you didn't get a chance to watch that, and understandably so, Nate, but Monday night he played with Cade out point guard the whole time in his minutes. I thought he had one of his better games, creating for teammates through a lot of really good passes. One thing he struggled with is putting passes on target, and he did that really well. And then last night into the game, they put the ball in his hands. They hunt the better matchup against Ochai as opposed to Davion Mitchell, and he pays it off with the bucket. I mean, I know for Pistons fans, that was a full circle moment after how he had to start last season coming off the bench and all of that. So I wanted to make sure that I got that in there. I want to circle back to Cade real quick, Nate.
Sure.
I just want to make sure, because I know this is probably going to be the feedback we get the most on. Do you still think he's the kind of the primary option for this team, even though you would like to see him play off the ball a little bit more? You know what I mean? Like, is he still the primary driver of offense for the Pistons, or you really think they need somebody else to do that and take quite a bit of that load off his shoulders?
Yeah, I think if you look at their long-term future, like I do think they need one more guy who's going to be better than what Cade is going to be. If you're talking about creating a team that's going to be a consistent, because when I think of any rebuild, I think your goal is maybe not necessarily to win an NBA championship, although obviously that's the ultimate goal, but to build a team that, but maybe you can only do that if you have a top 5 player in the league, and sometimes you just can't acquire that guy. But I think you want to at least build a team that's going to be a threat for getting home court advantage in your conference every year at the start of the year, and a team that's a threat to win a run. Like that's worth building, right? If you look back on an era of a team, something like the Grizzlies in the middle part of the last decade, for example, right? Like no one is like, oh, they should have blown it up sooner. Like that's an era that's looked back on fondly. That's what you're trying to build, and then maybe you catch lightning in a bottle with one of your prospects or a signing, and then you can get to the NBA Finals. Offensively, I'm just not sure. Like maybe they could just be so good defensively and do it that way with the likes of Asar and Ron Holland developing, and then maybe the idea of Cade as your point guard. You've got size and defense at every position, and you can kind of work your way to an average offense, and you do it defensively. That's not out of the question. But in terms of building an offense that is going to be a top 10 offense, which is really probably where you want to be, I'm never going to rule anything out with any prospect. But if I had to pick the most likely outcome, I don't think that Cade, as someone that I've really, really liked a lot over the years, I thought he would maybe get to this level, but I don't think he's shown enough yet to just assume that he's going to be the number one guy. I think he might even be, kind of a lower end all-star, but ideally, and again, this is easier said than done, you would want someone who's a better offensive player than Cade to come in, and he could maybe even still be the point guard. Maybe that guy is a great shooter or something like that. But I think Cade is your best offensive player. I think that's going to have a lower ceiling than the Pistons would want.
So I've talked about this a lot. I've always said that I didn't think Cade would be the leading scorer on the type of team you're talking about. I think I still see him a little bit more as the primary initiator of offense, but I think they need to bring in a real bucket getter, a real 25, 28 point a game a night. And like you said, that's really easy for me to say hey, go get that player that averages that many points, because not everybody can do that. But no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we're on the same page there. So Omari,
and quickly, just to react to that, I think, maybe utilizing the strengths of your coach and JB Bickerstaff to get players to defend who haven't defended before in the past is something that you could focus in on there, right? If you need one more guy who's just a bucket, but what's usually the weakness of such players? Well, they can't guard anybody. So could JB Bickerstaff get enough out of that player to make them a little bit more viable? I don't think they should touch the contract necessarily, but someone along the lines of a Zach LaVine, Trae Young would be a very interesting one as well to think about. But someone like that maybe would be, if the Pistons end up being good enough this year that it looks like they're just not going to be in the high lottery again and get that player through the draft, then, maybe you would consider a trade for someone who's a little bit more of a distressed asset, maybe doesn't have the greatest contract, but someone that maybe you think JB could get a little more out of on the defensive end, and that, could pair with Cade in it, to be a truly a 2-star alignment on the offensive end, but that is probably a better scorer than he is. That's an interesting thought for this group if they feel like, well, we're just, we're not going to get, another offensive superstar in the draft necessarily.
Sorry, Amari. So Brandon Ingram, that's a name that comes out all the time whenever we're talking. Is he that level? Is the contract situation, like you mentioned with Levine, too volatile? What are your thoughts there?
Nah, I think he's too similar to Cade in that,
Okay.
like I already mentioned, right, with the shot quality aspect. Now Ingram will make a few more of those than Cade will, but he still kind of has that slow kind of style. I think those guys have a lot of similarities to their game. I think Cade maybe is a little bit better of a passer. Ingram maybe a little bit better as a scorer. But no, I think that it would be maybe more of someone who would play off the ball a little bit more, like someone along the lines of like what the role Kyrie Irving is playing right now
Yes.
in
Yeah.
Dallas. I mean, again, that's well, I don't know, Kyrie, he'll be a free agent this offseason, but in all likelihood, but probably doesn't want to go to Detroit. So, but no, I think more someone at the guard position. I mean,
Okay.
maybe the other way you could do it would be if you got just like a great shooter at the 4. Maybe
Okay.
someone who would really make everyone's life, like a Lauri Markkanen type of guy. Again, not necessarily going to be available this offseason, but someone at the 4 that you can run plays for, who really is going to spread the floor and maybe not be the guy on ball, but kind of turbocharges Cade and Ivy. That would be another way to possibly do it.
Eric Manuel, this is not funny. Jeremy Grant could know. Amari, why does this person assume you don't have a girlfriend? This is rude. So for the audio,
I mean, I don't, but that's just, that was the first. Okay, so it says shout out to Omari for putting his all into a no sleep, unforgiving industry. I know it is hard to do so without having a GF to come home to. Yeah, I mean, some assumptions were made there. I mean, I don't have a girlfriend, but some assumptions were made there for sure.
Yeah, that's I don't appreciate that I appreciate the person tuning in and commenting. I don't appreciate you guys taking your shots at Amari like that. At least
it wasn't a shot. It wasn't a shot. It was I feel like it was an expression of empathy for the long, hard hours I put in.
They at least could have said it's hard to be the Detroit's most eligible bachelor. They at least could have framed it that way instead of just saying not having a girlfriend to come home to.
Yeah. Well, and especially
that really sounded lonely.
Especially being Detroit's most eligible bachelor, but also having to be on the road for 4 you can't even take advantage of it while you're there, right?
That's right, Nate. Okay. All right, Amari, get us back on track. I derailed us with the Cade conversation. We can get back to Ivy, or there's a bunch of other exciting.
I was just going to say this whole segment is like I just know in March there's going to be this raging should the Pistons tank or push for the playoffs debate. Not that we're talking about, is Cade the number 1 or do you still need another guy next to him? Plus the Pistons, I've kind of been cursed with getting the 5th overall pick 3 years in a row. So they're due for like a top 4 or 3 to get that second guy. Like you look at Charlotte, like you get Brandon Miller to put with the mellow ball, like that really sets you on the right track. Let's talk about Jaylen Duren. I think he's, like he is a guy that he just turned 21 last week, right? He's been a double threat, essentially since day one. Great chemistry with Cade. Still figuring things out defensively. He actually had probably one of his best defensive games last night, 4 blocks. What's been your impression of Jaylen Duren, and what do you see from him, and what do you hope to see from him?
Yeah, I think I've seen exactly what you would have hoped so far with him taking a step forward. I asked JB before that Washington game, what were some of the things that you were really focused on defensively? And he said, taking advantage of what Jaylen Duren and Isaiah Stewart and to a lesser extent Paul Reed can do, because we think that they have a lot of mobility, but they also have great athleticism to protect the rim. And Jaylen Duren was pretty bad defensively, as you guys know, in those first couple of years. I mean, you could look at the Pistons overall defense to see that. I know that they switched more on the perimeter, which was part of the reason for these numbers, but his rim protection numbers were awful. Again, we keep some numbers at Dunked on Prime, where last season Jaylen Duren contested only 24% of opponent shots around the rim. That is a terrible number for a center. The average center will contest around 33%. The best centers will contest over 40%. And then also he allowed 64% shooting at the rim on shots that he was within 5 feet of, which again is a really bad number. Your average center is probably about 58%. Your best guys in the league are in the low 50s, high 40s in that metric. Well, turn it around to this year now, and Jaylen Duren has upped his contest percentage from 24 to 31%, and he's allowing 51% shooting rather than 64% shooting on the shots that he challenges. So, and overall, the Pistons are allowing much worse shooting in the restricted area than they did a season ago. So you got to be really happy with that. I think also JB has kind of gotten him out of like some of the, more fanciful aspects of his offensive game, and allowed him to focus on what he does best. I mean, he started off the first 5 games, he was shooting like 85% from the field. And so like getting him to say, no, you know what, like the first thing for you is defense and finishing around the basket. Let's get you good at that stuff. And then, you can evolve into some other stuff. I think it's really been a great season of improvement so far from Duren.
Yeah, those are really awesome numbers to hear. And we've talked about it. I still have some critiques here and there on Duren's defense. I don't think he understands hand placement and the ball screen coverages sometimes and those type of things. But we always try to mention the rim protection. And last night was the perfect example. I think he had 4 blocks last night, and a lot of them were the rotate from the weak side variety, make extra efforts, those type of things. So it's, you always look at the block numbers, right, Nate? And like, that's what we have readily acceptable. Obviously, people need to subscribe to what you guys are putting out, because that data is awesome to hear you talk about. So him contesting in general has been awesome. We did see a little bit of that offense you mentioned come back last night. He had some grab and goes. He had some downhill drives, but Omari, I thought he kept the reins in on it a little bit, right? Like I don't think he got too crazy. Nate, are you completely anti
the main thing
that?
with Duren is that he pushes the ball a lot. So that's one thing I noticed a lot, is that it seems like half of their possessions he's the one pushing the ball up. So
Nate, are you completely anti ever a grab and go, ever a face up and downhill drive, or like just in certain situations? Like where are you at kind of? Because I think you always want to see a young player continue to expand their game a little bit and explore that studio space. But is it really like, no, just focus on the defense. We can worry about that later. Where are you at with his offense, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical that he's going to be a guy that you're truly going to run stuff through necessarily. I know he's shown some passing flashes.
Yeah.
So all right, if you want to run, some delay stuff or handoff stuff, let him throw a few backdoors on occasion. Like, yeah, I'm totally down with that. If it's going to be, throw it to them for an ISO or a post up and go score against your own man, maybe not. I think I did like at various games this season, him trying to duck in with that big body against guys who can't handle it. Like he completely dominated Alex Sarr physically, for example. Like Sarr is, a pretty skinny rookie, but that's what you want to see from someone like Duren. So I think just his overall offensive aggressiveness, I don't think he has an amazing feel for necessarily finishing under the basket on non-dunks or like little hook shots or something like that. But he's so big that, I think that's where I'd like to see him concentrate is, just getting great position. And yeah, if he's got the ball, he's got position at the charge circle, like throwing the ball there and let him shoot a little hook shot or get fouled. Like that's what I like. And yeah, if he wants to bring the ball up a little bit off a rebound, like that's not going to hurt anything. That kind of does just make everyone else run with him a little bit. You better run with him or he'll probably turn it over if you don't, because he doesn't have anyone to pass to. So yeah, I think it's, again, there's more to explore there. Again, I think a Jared Allen is a very good analog, and the way JB started using him last year when some of the guys went down in Cleveland as more of an offensive hub, like, yeah, I think that could certainly happen for Duren, but I don't necessarily see him as, taking a lot of threes necessarily at any point. I know he's hit like a corner 3 on occasion for this team, or, someone that you're really going to rely on to create the offensive advantage.
I'm glad you brought up the non-dunk finishing around the rim. He had one last night where he caught it down there and you could tell he just wasn't comfortable, and he eventually dribbled himself into like a 6-foot fadeaway that he missed short.
Like a lot of pump faking to, or like kind of getting him like pivoting and then getting stuck under the rim, like that kind of stuff. Like, he doesn't have a great understanding for just like how to use his shoulders to carve out space and create angles down there.
Omari, more Jaylen Duren, or you want to move to somebody else?
That's the last question on him. His archetype, obviously, rim runner on the offense, rim protector on defense is a build you could build around. But typically for those centers, they really have to be elite defensively for it to work full time, right? What sort of defensive ceiling do you see for Jaylen Duren? And has he at this point shown that he's a guy you should be prioritizing going forward?
I mean, I think he's totally fine as your center that you want to invest in. Now, do you want to pay that guy $30 billion a year, DeAndre Ayton style? Like, I don't know. I mean, I think I would, invest in him at the level of a starter. I think we'll see how the rest of this year plays out and how everything looks. But yeah, I think that's reasonable. Now, is he going to play 35 minutes a night? Like, no, I think if you going to give him, kind of a market level contract. I mean, you look at like what Ivica Zubac, who I consider a superior player, is making, something along those lines. Onyeka Okongwu is probably someone who maybe accomplished less offensively, but more defensively. So, something in that kind of like, reasonable starter sort of range. And then like being able to pair him with Stewart, who's also on a reasonable contract. I think that's a pretty good basis going forward. We've seen the Mavericks really succeed with having 48 minutes of good center play. And if he doesn't have to play 35 minutes, he can be more aggressive, block more shots, run the floor harder. Both those guys can really make an impact on the offensive glass, which this team is going to need. So, yeah, I think he could be certainly a part of what they're doing going forward. I do share some of Bryce's concerns about him as a pick and roll defensive technician and just the overall feel. He is exceedingly young still. He was really young when he was drafted, so maybe that's something that can develop, but sometimes it doesn't. So, yeah, we saw that comment there that is his age still a factor. I think it is to some degree, but there are also, usually like if you have some feel, you probably would show it at this point. But, given his physical characteristics, he doesn't need great feel. He just needs to play hard. And, yeah, you know what? He might like not be perfect in the pick and roll every single time, but he could make up for a lot of that with athleticism. So, yeah, I think he could be a quality starter for these guys going forward.
So for fans listening, as we know, when the season's over, the Jaden Ivey, Jaylen Duren contract conversations will start. Zubac got essentially a 3-year, $60 million contract this offseason is what Nate was referencing there. So, just keep that in mind as we start to have those conversations. Obviously, there's still 60 more games for Duren to continue to show this progression, and especially defensively. But we need to go to a short break. Omari, when we come back, take it wherever you want with the team. If you are watching live first, thank you so much. Hit the like, subscribe, all of that, all of those buttons. And if you have any questions for Nate, it was kind of exciting because it's the first time we've had Nate on. So it was really cool to have somebody new. So I'm sure you guys have questions for Nate. Throw them in there. We'll go through rapid fire, whatever you guys have. But Omari, we'll get into whoever you want right after this short break.
All right, we're back with segment 3. Let's talk about Ron Holland because I know he's somebody who's caught your attention a couple times. He fought for the loose ball with Royce O'Neal, I think, in their first preseason
he might still be fighting for that loose ball, actually.
And I don't think he really played a lot against the Wizards when you were there. But I mean, just as a guy who was a top 5 pick. I think turned some heads with the Ignite last season, but obviously that probably wasn't an ideal situation. Just what was your opinion of him coming into the draft, and what have you seen from him so far?
Yeah, I liked him. I had him number 3 on my board, although somewhat by default, I would say. A lot of that is just due to the position that he played, and I thought he showed more ball skills than advertised with the Ignite. Obviously, the shooting is a major question. It's been perhaps even possibly worse than advertised now, to where I think, I haven't seen their last couple of games, but I think he had gotten to the point where he's starting to turn down some shots in the last Pistons game that I saw. His athleticism and effort is obviously fantastic, like for a team that I think started with Troy Weaver, but when you look at Asar Thompson and him and Jaden Ivey, Duren, Stewart, like this is a team that in the greatest Detroit tradition is going to be built to just overwhelm teams physically, and I think he could be a big part of that. And I also think certainly handling in transition, and even as someone who on occasion can get to the basket in the half court off the dribble. I think that he kind of has that latent talent. I think if he ever could become a good enough scorer, that he would be a good enough passer. Like he got some of those reps with the G League Ignite last year. But of course, the shooting is the major question. Pretty much every other aspect of his game, I'm a big fan of.
And you mentioned that he was on your board number 3 pretty much by default. Can you kind of walk us through that a bit? This was obviously a weird draft with a lot of improving guys at the top. Was it just you liked Ron Holland's upside? What was it about him that sort of made him that number 3?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was that I didn't really love anyone below the top 2. But for me, I think that he is just like playing the wing position, having the level of athleticism that he does. He's always going to compete. He, I think, can be maybe is a little bit small to be, a stopper on everybody, but certainly someone that you can throw in that I think will be a quality defensive option, help force turnovers on the defensive end. And then, yeah, like I said, like any kind of a wing like that, and they got Fred Vincent in now. We'll see what he can do with Holland and Nassar. Those will be his two star pupils, and it's going to take a few years to see those results. But I think it's a good gamble to take for someone who could do everything else than shoot, because we have seen guys improve a lot of shooters. Some guys don't, but it's hard to know exactly who that's going to be at that early stage. So why not draft someone who could do everything else and see if you can develop that, as opposed to someone who just you're always going to have a ceiling on that guy. So I don't know if he's going to be a superstar necessarily. I don't know that anyone in that draft was, but that was my thinking behind having him at that level.
So real quick shout out here as well. This is Hadley Panzer. So this is a kid I coached in high school. Actually didn't get to coach him. I came the year after, but he was still around. He's the starting offensive lineman for the Kansas State Wildcats right now. So shout out Hadley. Hadley, you should be at practice. I don't know why you're watching a podcast about the Pistons. I don't even think you played basketball in high school. Actually, I think Hadley played summer basketball 1 year and hit the game-winning shot against the team I was coaching, and he didn't even play. No, literally the best kid I've ever been around. Like grade A person. He's a great role model to my oldest son and a big time football player. Maybe he'll be playing for the Detroit Lions next year.
Shout out to Hadley, man.
Yeah. Big time. I'm telling, like, big person, like legit big, but also just a great human being. And they got a big game against Iowa State this Saturday. So good luck to Hadley. Thanks for touching base here. Okay. So this question, Nate, Ausar is better than Ron right now, in my opinion. This is from new YouTube user. I would agree with that. Who is the better prospect? So I guess essentially kind of what I want to ask here, Nate, I think that you would go Cade, J.I., J.D. in terms of like prioritizing the younger players. Is it then Ausar and then Ron Holland, or would you flip that, or am I like flipping that around on you?
Yeah, Ausar came back last night, right?
He did.
Yeah. Yeah. How'd he look briefly?
He got better as the game went, I thought.
Real quick, Hadley said he has meetings in 10 minutes. Yeah, get to your meeting, Hadley. You got more important stuff to do. He looked like their best perimeter defender, Nate. Like, no question. Yeah. Like when he came in to guard RJ Barrett or Scotty Barnes, it was different than anybody else.
Yeah.
I thought the handle looked a little better. I thought he had some good creation. The
Pretty
jumper
fluid.
looked a little
The three he hit looked good. Like
fluid?
He was 1 of 2 for 3. Yeah.
Yeah. So even the one he missed.
He had more air balls than threes last year, right? Wasn't that the stat?
Yeah. It was rough. And for the record, Ron's 2 threes last night did not look good. So, so first, is it KJIJD for you? Like, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the case. Yeah, okay. I think just because Duren to me is like there's always going to be a limited ceiling on someone who is kind of that rim running center type. Is a valuable player, but it's also that's probably never going to be an all-star. Whereas Ivy, I don't know that I foresee stardom in his future either. But I think there's, with his physical characteristics and the juice that he has on the ball, like you could see it possibly happening. So,
and then does Ausar or Ron overtake either of those guys? And if not, then how would you rank them against each other?
Yeah, I think that certainly either of them could kind of get into that number 2 position, just because of the value of the position that they play. At least from how I saw them as prospects, and I'm not sure where Ausar is at with the jumper right now, having not seen it since last year, but I thought that his jumper was pretty much busted and just wasn't ever going to get any better. Whereas I didn't feel that way about Holland.
Same.
Because Holland had shot it a little bit better at the lower levels. Holland's also like still a pretty young guy. So that's why I probably would have had Holland above Ausar, even though I completely agree with you that Ausar is, has the ability to be one of the best wing defenders in the league, which I don't think that Ron Holland has, because he's just a little bit, he doesn't have like that same strong body type, maybe not quite the same lateral movement. Like Ron, I think, moves better in a straight line than he does laterally. So I think I would probably say Ausar is, going to be the better player right now, because he can really come in and play a role, whereas Ron is, probably kind of just out there running around and doing a few things, but also making mistakes.
Yeah.
So, but I probably I would say Ron is the higher upside just because I think he has a better chance of actually translating his jump shot into something real. Whereas Asar, I see the most likely outcome is he's going to struggle. But hey, in Fred Vincent we trust, right?
Yeah, a lot of trust in Fred Vincent. So we got 10 minutes left. We got a few questions here. I think some of them are really interesting, even one non-Pistons one, which I think will be fun to get into.
Oh yeah.
And so if you guys have any question, please drop them in. We'll get to them. This first one, I think you're going to crush Pistons fans' hearts on this one, but from It Never Makes No Sense, given the Jalen Green contract, who has a cleaner future, Pistons or Rockets?
Oh, easily the
Yeah.
Rockets. I mean, number one for the Rockets is they have a million assets in the draft coming to them, which the
Yeah.
Pistons don't. I mean, that's sort of what I was talking about back at the beginning with where I thought Troy Weaver really struggled was in that asset accumulation mode that you should go into in a rebuild. And of course, the Rockets were able to trade away James Harden to start the rebuild. The Pistons had, broken down Blake Griffin. That is a difference. I recognize that. So that would be number one. And yeah, I mean, I probably would say, other than Cade, there are like 4 or 5 guys I like on the Rockets better before the next Pistons prospect. So the Jalen Green contract is pretty short. Yeah, he has not shot it well this year, but let's also not forget that the Rockets have like a +7 net rating, and they're like 10-4 or something, 10-5.
Yeah.
And like they're probably going to make the playoffs this year. Like they're in good position in the NBA Cup. Watch that tonight. This year. So I mean, they're a much better team now, and they have much better prospects, and they have better assets in the future. So paying Jalen Green $30 million, that's actually will be tradable salary. It's not that long of a deal. So even if it doesn't work out, I think that deal is fine, and it doesn't really affect things.
And Cam Whitmore's not even playing for them, not even in their rotation, and Reed Shepherd's only playing 12 minutes a night. So yeah, there's a lot of talent on that.
Yeah, I mean, either of those guys might be the second best prospect on the Pistons, and they're not even getting ticked for those guys.
Yep.
Those were probably my 2 favorite prospects in the Pistons range in both of those drafts. So there you go.
Yeah, this was a very big Cam Whitmore podcast during that year. So
yeah, we'll go.
I would have had Asar higher in that draft for the record.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. But, as this guy's comment says, though, yeah, Shaedon Sharpe. I actually had Shaedon Sharpe as my number 1 in the same tier with Paolo in that 22 draft. So yeah, I thought they absolutely should have taken Shaedon Sharpe in that draft. He's just a little cleaner of a fit than Ivy, too, as just like more of a prototypical shooting guard off the ball. I do think his fit with Cade, because like what were we just talking about 10 minutes ago, of like the trading for sort of that off-ball bucket getter who can shoot, and Sharpe to me has more defensive ability, at least in terms of his athleticism, than the typical player of that ilk. So yeah, I would have loved that pairing. I think it would have been really good.
Yeah, Shaedon Sharpe did not play college basketball. So I guess your evaluation of him, were you basing that off of just like high school film? Were you able to watch him in person for workouts?
YouTube highlights, baby.
Real quick. The question is, would a healthy Cade and Shaedon Sharpe pairing have been the right move in retrospect? We gotta cater to our audio only listeners as well here.
Okay. Oh yeah. Sorry. So yeah, I think it probably would have been rather than Ivy. I still like Sharpe better than Ivy.
Okay, and then Omari, what did you ask about his scouting of Shaedon Sharpe that year?
Yeah. So just in your evaluation of Shaedon Sharpe, just how well of a feel were you able to get for him? I think he was like the 6th or 7th overall pick. So, still a lottery guy, but not playing college basketball. How much did that complicate your evaluation of him?
Oh, quite a bit. But again, it was just, I was like, hey, like this guy can dribble, pass, and shoot, and he's a nuclear athlete. And so, yeah, I realized that he doesn't have much of a track record in terms of college basketball. I didn't necessarily hold that against him. Like a lot of people were like, oh, well, he doesn't have the right mental makeup. I was like, hey, they absolutely made the right business decision. The guy got drafted in the lottery. So he wouldn't have been eligible until like, January anyway. He would have been trying to work his way in. It wouldn't have been an ideal situation. So why not just like get yourself drafted and just continue to work on your game? So I didn't hold that against him like personally. It did make the evaluation harder. But yeah, that was another draft where I just wasn't incredibly high on a lot of guys. In retrospect, obviously, Chet would have been a much better pick than Sharpe. Chet's been amazing. But, I still think, that holds up reasonably well. I off the top of my head, I would have to go back and look at it. I think I would have Sharpe in that next group in that draft below Paolo and Holmgren if he had to redo it. So basically, it was just like, hey, the guy's a great athlete and he can dribble and shoot, and showed a little bit of latent passing ability in the AAU film that I watched. So I was like, yeah, I don't love everybody else here. Like, I draft for upside, so that's why I had him there.
All right, I want to get to for sure these next two. This one is a Pistons one, and then we have a general CBA question from Arn. What do you think Duren's best coverage right now is, and long term? So ball screen coverage, I assume we're asking here. Is he essentially? I think they were asking, is he a pure drop coverage guy? Do you think he can play a little bit higher? Definitely not a switch guy. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what I kind of would like about it is, especially if he can get a little bit better at his communication. Like, he does have some pretty decent mobility relative to a lot of these centers. So, it obviously depends on the matchup. And that's something that JB talked about. Is like, he does feel like he has at least the mobility to execute a few different things. But like, what I kind of like is, play him in more of a drop at this point, because you just need to keep him closer to the rim and let him have an impact. I think if he gets out in the perimeter, like, some bigs can be out in the perimeter and actually then get back to protect the rim. I don't think he has that level of awareness quite yet. He would switch out in the perimeter and then just, be stuck 30 feet from the basket and never get back into the play. So you don't want him doing that necessarily. But I think something like a drop, and then, if it is someone, especially because the Pistons also have some bigger on-ball defenders. So maybe it starts off in a drop and then you do a late switch if you need to, against some of the best guys, like, say a Trae Young or something like that. Someone who's got a really good floater. You can have it in, like, maybe a little bit more aggressive of a drop, not just like totally bound in the paint. And then if he needs to do a late switch, he can do that. And, someone like an Asar can take the big. And then, if it's late clock, maybe Duren could follow that guy out to the perimeter and, force him to take a difficult shot over a contest. So I think that's kind of what I like there.
Omari, we got one more there.
Yep, we have one more from Key in Paris. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Slightly national question, but what do you guys think with CBA leading to more parity, or some would argue mediocrity, versus fewer super teams? So basically just the new CBA. How do you think that's going to affect parity going forward?
Yeah, to me, the greatest moments, I mean, you guys grew up, I'm sure, in Detroit with some of those great Pistons teams. I grew up in Chicago, so I remembered, great teams is what made the NBA. Great teams clashing in the playoffs, great teams that were together for a time that you got to know them. And yeah, I don't need to see 2017 Warriors, but that, I think the league overreacted to that just because of that cap spike, which they took care of by smoothing the increase in this TV deal that's coming up. So I think it was a response to a problem that didn't particularly exist, and it takes away the ability to keep good teams together. Like why should the Boston Celtics have to be like broken up right now? Like, they did a great job of building that team. Like, why do they deserve that? Like, I don't think that, like, that is a team that could be a fixture in this league for years and years and years. They already have been. And to say that, like, oh no, we're gonna like take away their draft pick because they built a good team and they paid good players that they acquired, they did. It's not like they acquired all these guys in free agency. Like, they traded for them. They just did a great job of building these teams. So I don't understand why that needs to be punished. And I think it's not great for the league to not have, like, I think the parity thing is good, but the NBA is built on stars ultimately, and stars in the playoffs. And so I don't think it's the number one problem with the league, because I think that's, just overall the number of injuries, and that the schedule is too long and just too demanding, and you don't get to see the best teams match up in the playoffs. But I don't think it's great to be breaking up these teams that I thought the old system was working just fine. Like, these high spending teams like weren't like killing it in the last CBA. Like, if Golden State doesn't happen to win the 22 championship out of nowhere, do any of these laws get enacted? Like, probably not, right?
Yeah, and like, I think about the Thunder. I don't know that this is going to happen, but how much would it suck if they had to break up a bunch of guys they drafted? They drafted
Totally.
the majority of these guys, and then okay. So I have one that you mentioned the MLE earlier. So I just have a cap. A lot of teams did not use their MLE this last offseason. Do you think that's something that continues? Do you think, because the new CBA allows that as a trade exception, if I'm not mistaken. So do you think we see a lot of them used at the trade deadline? And do you think this next offseason we continue to see teams be a little bit more I'm trying to think, cautious with how they use that MLE compared to maybe what we've seen in the past? Or am I off completely on how much teams have used it?
No, you're 100% correct
Okay.
there. I do think teams have been conservative for a number of reasons. Like you mentioned, nobody knows how useful that MLE trade exception is going to be. It's also just a way to like not spend that much money, right? Like most of the teams in the league are going to be in that range between the cap and the tax. And that is the range that on a year-to-year basis, obviously you can sell the team for more at the end, but on a year-to-year cash in, cash out basis, how much you spend between the cap and the tax is probably going to determine whether you're profitable that year. And so the mid-level, coincidentally, comes in right at that range. So that's I think is somewhat of a reason for that. But then also teams like, we're really close to these aprons. We don't want to get hard capped, although that's kind of a canard because you're getting hard capped above the tax that most teams aren't going to go above under any circumstances anyway. So I think that's part of it. The idea of like wanting to make a trade, worry about the aprons, or just taking on general long-term salary. But I do think, as we talked about with Beasley, that I think a lot of teams missed a chance to get good players on good contracts this offseason because the cap is going to be going up a lot. And I think that most of these teams make the error of just assuming that, hey, whatever conditions persist in this offseason is just what it's going to be forever. Whereas I think teams with a little more foresight could have signed guys and been like, oh, yeah, we're paying Malik Beasley $9 million a year. That's like ninth man money. That's a good contract 2 years from now.
Omari, you got anything else before we let Nate go?
No, I think I'm all set.
Nate, please let all of our listeners, viewers, watchers, everything like that know where they can find your work. You gave a ton of really cool data, numbers, stats, insights. So they need to be digesting all of the information, all of the stuff you're putting out there. So please let everybody know where they can find all of it.
Yeah, it's going to be at Nate Duncan NBA on Twitter. And that, of course, we'll have links to everything that we're doing, including the NBA strategy stream on League Pass with my partner, Danny LaRue. We do a few games a year on League Pass. If you're a League Pass subscriber, you can catch those of us calling the game live with these numbers and insights. And then also we do 2 public podcasts a week, either on YouTube or you can just search Dunked On in your podcast player. I'm sure that'll be in the show notes here. And then also I'm about to record the Hollinger and Duncan podcast with the venerable John Hollinger in about 30 minutes. So you can catch that as well.
Thanks so much, Nate, man. This was a blast. Yeah. Omari, take
Nate,
it away.
Really, really appreciate it, man. It was a blast to have you on. Hopefully we could do it again a little bit down the road once the team, maybe moves into a new phase of the rebuild. We'll see, right? But again, we really appreciate it. So thanks a lot for joining us. And with that, I'll close this out. So big thanks to our audio producer, Robin Chan, our editor-in-chief, Nicole Avery Nichols, and our executive producer, Bill Bradley. And big shout out to Wes Davenport, as always. And we'll talk to you all next week.